Good morning, everyone. Morning. I love a lively crowd. My name is Chris Seri. I'm the CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and welcome to Day 2 of Capitol Hill Ocean Week 2018. I hope yesterday's conversations left everyone feeling energized about the opportunities to make a difference and inspired to tackle the challenges that we're facing with oceans and Great Lakes conservation. We had some terrific panels yesterday, and we were really fortunate to have Congresswomen Pingree and Bordillo and Congressman McEachin join us to announce legislation that they're working on ocean conservation. And I'm very excited to have our congressional roundtable this afternoon. I want to thank our sponsors who make this week possible, our signature sponsor, NOAA, and our presenting sponsors, the Philip Stevenson Foundation, the Henry Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Go ahead and see the videos.
NOAA's work spans from the bottom of the sea to the surface of the sun. Each day, our employees take the pulse of the changing world around us and share that knowledge with others to ensure public safety, protect and restore marine resources, and strengthen our economy.
I like to say that the Gulf of Mexico is America's coast. It's critically important in terms of what it produces for the United States in terms of energy, in terms of shipping, in terms of fisheries. My job is to just get the message out far and wide that Louisiana is facing a really dire coastal crisis.
In 1927, we set the Mississippi River in its channel. That was good for us to build communities, but in the long term, it was very bad.
We began to starve the delta of the very thing which had built it, which is sediment carried by the Mississippi River.
We often get asked if these issues related to coastal land loss are fixable or solvable, and wholeheartedly the answer is yes.
Thank you. I also want to thank our sponsors who made last night Ocean Awards Gala a tremendous success, and I especially want to recognize the McDonald's Corporation for hosting a very fun cocktail reception. So here to provide our opening remarks for the Margaret Davidson Emerging Leaders panel is Congressman Jimmy Panetta. Congressman Panetta represents California's Central Coast, home of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. The Serengeti of the Sea, as it's known, Monterey is the largest protected area in the continental United States. Congressman Panetta is a leader in the House on both climate and ocean issues, and we are very fortunate to have him here this morning. Thank you, Congressman Panetta.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for that. And obviously, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. But most importantly, Chris, thank you for everything that you've done for the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, having a wonderful Oceans Prom, as they called it last night, the Capitol Hill Oceans Week, and of course, Chris, all that you do for our oceans every day. Thanks to the participants that you're going to be hearing from in this Margaret Davidson Emerging Leaders Roundtable, Drs. Coughlin, McKaylee, Dr. Perry, and Mrs. Deniston. And of course, all of you, the attendees here at CHOW. I am so appreciative that there are so many people, but I'm not surprised as to why all of you have taken time out of your lives to come here to Washington, D.C. and get more focused on our oceans and more focused on what we stand for. Once again, my name is Jimmy Panetta, and I represent the Central Coast of California, the most beautiful congressional district in the nation. Now, it was funny because when I introduced myself to my Democratic colleagues up in Washington, D.C. back in November of 2016 when I got elected, that wasn't the response I got from them. They actually booed and hissed. And my reaction to them was, well, then I guess you have never been to the Central Coast of California. Because to me, there's no doubt that it is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and now people are seeing it. I actually attended a filming last week of Big Little Lies, the HBO series, and they actually said that obviously the actors had shaped that show, but once they got through with season 1, they realized it was the scenery that added so much to that show, and so that's why they've returned for season 2, thank goodness. But they only showed a little bit of what my district entails. We have over 276 miles of coastline. We have the scenic Big Sur coastline, which you're very familiar with, all the way to the Santa Cruz Beach and Boardwalk, from Pebble Beach to Carmel Beach. We have the Point Lobos State Reserve to the Elkhorn Slough National Reserve, and we have the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and of course, the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. Clearly, it is beautiful. Clearly, that translates into a $3 billion tourism industry, but it also has more than economic meaning. It has sentimental meaning, especially for me. It is my home. It's where my Italian grandfather immigrated to back in the 1930s, raised his family. My father was raised there. He raised his family, myself and my 2 brothers, and now my wife and I raise our 2 daughters in that area. And so clearly, it means a lot to us. And no matter how long you've been there, though, be it if it's your home or be it if you're just a weekender on a visit from LA or San Francisco down to Monterey, that place affects you. And that is why we have so much pride in our national treasures. That is why we have done so much to protect and preserve our crown jewels. That is why we have National Park, we have 2 national monuments, and of course we have that National Marine Sanctuary. That is why we have 24 marine research organizations that literally line the crescent of Monterey Bay that are working to basically protect our national security when it comes to the sea level rise and the effects of that, our food security, solving acidification and researching aquaculture, our environmental security, especially when it comes to keeping our oceans, our sanctuaries, and our monuments free from oil spills and plastics. We have done the work, and we are continuing to do the work to put protections in place to preserve the future of our ocean, and that is how I believe we preserve the future of our families. Now, when I think of the protections that have been placed, though, I have to tell you, I do think of a quote that my wrestling coach told me in high school. And he said, "Look, Jimmy, once you make your mark in the world, watch out for those with the erasers." Now, right now, we feel like we have an administration with some big erasers. And I believe that they have come in the form of executive orders. Executive orders that I believe have the goal of tearing down the protections we've put in place by opening and exploiting our national marine sanctuaries, our national monuments, and our outer continental shelf. I can tell you, though, that there are many members here in Congress that are working to stop those erasers, not just Democrats, but Republicans, and not just with legislation, but with limiting the appropriations designated for such executive orders. We're seeing that with the bipartisanship that I experience on Capitol Hill, because I do believe that protecting our oceans and coasts from oil spills and securing our tourism and military installations and coastal communities is not just a political issue. It is a coastal issue. It is a national issue. We saw that coast to coast when Republicans in Florida started pushing back on the administration in that executive order that opened up, that wants to open up the outer continental shelf. I see it in Congress in my work on the bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, a group of 70 congressional members, a purely bipartisan caucus, meaning you have to have the same number of Democrats as you do Republicans that are actually coming together and talking about the effects of climate change. Now, once again, you may not see any major pieces of legislation come out of this caucus, but it's a start. It's a foundation, and it's a beginning for Democrats and Republicans who are willing to come to the table, sit down at the table together, and actually talk about something that wasn't done before, and that's the effects of climate change. The leadership that we're seeing, though, we're not seeing leadership in this area, though, down here in this area on Pennsylvania Avenue. And I believe that when it comes to the leadership on dealing with our oceans, we're not going to see it from this administration. We're not going to see it from the top down. But look around this room. Look around our communities. We will see it. We are seeing it from the bottom up. I saw it during the public comment period for these executive orders that were put in place, where 1.6 million people took the time to share their opinions with the administration. I saw it at the town halls that were sponsored by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And I saw it, and I see it today, at the rallies and protests, where thousands and thousands of people come out and speak out against those erasers for the protections already in place and placing that upward pressure on our decision makers, no matter what party they're in, no matter what level they are at. And we're seeing it today. We're seeing it when we have experts like our participants and people like you who really are our boots on the ground, who can come to our nation's capital, get informed, and most importantly, share that information with others. Now, last night at the gala, we recognized and we honored one of those boots on the ground, Will Benson. He received the Volunteer of the Year award. And in his remarks, which I caught, he said, we have a responsibility to our children to protect our oceans. And part of that means being optimistic about our future and our role in our future when it comes to our oceans. I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, by being here this week, you are giving all of us optimism. You understand that our future depends on our research and our knowledge of the seas, but also our responsibility to the oceans. That is how we not only stay optimistic, that is how we uphold our protections of the past and how we continue to fight for our future, for our home, and we make damn sure that we're going to protect our oceans and so that they will never, ever be erased. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Panetta. Margaret Davidson was a pioneer in coastal management. Her efforts impacted countless individuals who worked tirelessly to protect our coasts. And we honor Margaret's legacy each year with the Margaret Davidson's Emerging Leaders Roundtable. This panel features individuals like Margaret who are pioneers, constantly seeking to push the envelope in their field. You'll see that this year we have placed an emphasis on the role of business and corporate sustainability as a critical partner for ensuring the health of our oceans and Great Lakes. The innovative thinking of our emerging leaders gives me hope for new solutions and for a groundswell of change that can keep our oceans and Great Lakes healthy. Here to moderate this panel is Adam Lowry. Adam is co-founder and co-CEO of Ripple Foods. Ripple Foods is disrupting the $100 billion plus global dairy market with plant-based milks that are high in protein, low in sugar, and as somebody that drinks it, I know it's personally delicious. Prior to joining Ripple, Adam was a co-founder and, I love this title, Chief Greenskeeper of Method Products, the leading innovator in sustainable home cleaning products. And Adam is also a trustee for the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. We're really fortunate to have him as someone on our board with his backgrounds and skills. So welcome, Adam, and all of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for attending the Margaret Davidson Emerging Leaders Roundtable. We have a star-studded panel this morning of people that are following in Margaret's footsteps, and I want to get right to it. On my left, I have Bridget Coughlin, President and CEO of Shed Aquarium. On Bridget's left, we have Carrie Deniston, Senior Director for Sustainability for the Walmart Foundation. Next is Ruth Perry, Marine Scientist and Regulatory Specialist for Shell Oil Company. And finally, we've got Doug McCauley, Associate Professor, Director of the Benioff Ocean Initiative at UCSB. So it's been said that environmental problems can only be solved when all sectors of the economy come together to find solutions. And on today's panel, we of course have pioneers from industry, from the nonprofit sector, from academia. And we're here at CHOW, which is the premier annual conference addressing coastal, marine, and Great Lakes issues, where we're supposed to have outcomes that lead to policy that helps us out. So we're going to get to that, but first I'd like the audience to understand a little bit more about what each of you are doing and the change you're trying to bring about. And so, Bridget, I'd like to start with you. Since taking the helm at SHED, you've refreshed and re-energized the mission. You've said that you want SHED to be, quote, a portal that connects people to the aquatic world. How is SHED doing that, and why is it important?
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm representing really a collective of aquariums that will collectively be a portal. We have an aquarium conservation partnership, and in true Washingtonian style, the acronym is cleverly ACP. And it is a group of 22 aquariums in the United States that see 19 million people a year. Now, the entire population of the United States is 325. And we see 19 million people a year. That's 55,000 people a day. And we see all kinds. We are truly hoping to be ground zero of the groundswell that the congressman referenced to catalyze change on our key issues, which are upping the narrative within the entire United States population on plastic, and also being better stewards of how we run our own businesses. Through a single-use plastic lens, using our collective voice, because these aquariums are from that beautiful Monterey to Boston to Corpus Christi, Texas to Shedd Aquarium, and using the districts that we have to advocate for marine sanctuaries and marine monuments, and even teaching the public what that means, even in the Midwest amongst the Great Lakes. And then obviously advancing what Monterey Bay has been doing for a long time, the aquarium there, sustainable seafood. And the complicated narrative of it's not just what you eat, but how it was caught and when it was caught, and the traceability, and having that conversation amongst those 55,000 people that will be at the aquarium right now. And I'm so happy to be here.
She doesn't have her phone on her, so it's good. Yeah.
And then, of course, advocating on some legislation for shark finning. You know, years ago, the aquarium community did not have policy directors, and we do now. Andrea Densham is here in the audience, working on Capitol Hill on all these issues. So that is what we're up to, and really here as a collective voice, and like I said, ground zero for that groundswell, because we see visitors with red baseball caps and lettering, and visitors without red baseball caps, and everyone in between.
Mm-hmm. It's important to reach everyone. Thank you. Ruth, I want to go to you next. You've focused on public-private partnerships in your role with Shell, among other things. Tell us a little bit about some of those partnerships with scientists, and most importantly, why is Shell doing this?
Certainly. So I'm representing the energy industry. So we're not only an oil and gas company, but we're a true end-to-end market with energy development. And Bridget talked about the 55,000 people coming a day. Well, the global population is about to hit 9 billion people, and that requires energy, and it requires sustainable energy. But part of working the energy, developing the energy, getting it to market, means that we have to be a trusted operator. And part of being a trusted operator at Shell means that we're responsible stewards of the environments that we work in. So I work in the offshore for Shell. So I help Shell figure out what is the offshore environments that they're working in, what does it mean to be a steward, and how do we contribute the knowledge that we have, the technology, the data, and put that back to the communities that are trying to make sure and keep us accountable to being that environmental steward, as well as understanding what's out in the ocean and making sure that we don't have an impact. So one of the best mechanisms we found to do that is public-private partnerships. We're not alone in this. We're one of the users of ocean resources, but there's many others, and there's many others that are working, living, and using those oceans. And so public-private partnerships brings people around to the table, and it allows us to leverage our strengths together and to kind of achieve a goal together. And so it's not one entity that's responsible for this. The best example, I think the most relevant, if there's any Texans in here or Floridians, we had quite a hurricane season last year, right? I had 50 inches of rain at my house in 2.5 days from Harvey. Unprecedented, right? Hurricanes are a big deal, not just to the coastal communities, but Shell, at any given day, we have 10 to 20,000 people working offshore. We have to be able to get those people offshore and shut down our platforms days in advance of the weather service announcements that you're getting for the coastal communities. So we have to look at those storms as they're coming across in the Caribbean. But that requires a lot of data. It requires observations, modeling, and there's other groups that are also collecting this information. So we've gotten together with NOAA, with the Navy, and with universities in the Gulf of Mexico to really leverage all of our strengths together and really push forward our data knowledge and collection on the loop current system, the Gulf of Mexico, what's happening in the environment, and provide all of that data that we're collecting publicly so that it can be integrated by all the entities that are modeling, that are trying to get coastal community evacuations, that are trying to get people offshore. And we found that by kind of doing this together, then we've really amplified the amount of data that we have, and we're really projecting the science forward. And it's not on one group to do that. We found that it's better to collaborate, leverage our strengths, and really build sustained observations. And so that's one example of a public-private partnership. The other one that I think is most relevant to this group is the flower garden banks. Climate change is something that Shell recognizes. And if you go and read about our corporate sustainability and our corporate position, you'll see that. Our CEO is very strongly opinionated on this topic. But the Flower Garden Banks is a unique sanctuary because it's operated in the Gulf of Mexico. It's been this flourishing system in the midst of the heaviest oil and gas offshore industry producing area. And so we want to make sure that that sanctuary can continue to be healthy and it can continue to thrive. So that means that we should also be a steward of that sanctuary. And so we've been working through another partnership to do ocean acidification monitoring, to get universities out there to help NOAA with their mission, and to really start looking at ocean acidification, the dynamics of the reef, how these natural disasters, things like Harvey, when you have the trillion gallons of water that's coming off the Houston Channel, what's going to happen when that water goes over the Flower Garden Banks, fresh water? So we've gotten together to develop these monitoring systems using and leveraging Shell's technology along with our industry partners and putting sustained observations in place at the flower gardens to look at these long-term changes.
Cool, thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Doug, I'd like to go to you next. So you focused a lot of your work on how ecosystems function in a changing world. And I think one of the really interesting things that you're doing is actually in one of our sanctuaries. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. Maybe I'll just give you a bit of background, and which is to say that I do a lot of research. I'm an associate professor now at UC Santa Barbara, and I love doing research, but we've pivoted recently to also, I now direct a center called the Benioff Ocean Initiative, which is about using science and using scientists to try to make change. And so we've just had the privilege of beginning a project in a sanctuary, in the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, which is about trying to use science, use technology to make change. And I can tell you a little bit about that. It's about whales, please, actually. Yeah. So the way that we've engaged with whales was a kind of random thing. I'd actually like to play for you, if it's okay, my favorite song, Adam, by way of explanation of how we got into whales, how somebody who did work on ecosystems that did not involve whales got involved in whales, and what we're doing with the Benioff Ocean Initiative and the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary here on whales. This is my favorite song. So I could listen to this forever. I will spare you here. And I want to play a video for you now, if I can. Oops. Let's see.
It's playing behind us, yeah.
It takes me up into the clouds, which is not where I want to be. I want to be under the ocean. Let me just tell you a story then, and I'll create this vision for you. That's my video. Now we're under the sea. I was sitting in my office, it was a Sunday afternoon at UC Santa Barbara, and I got a call from the Coast Guard, and they said, okay, Doug, we've got a problem. We got a whale stuck in the harbor. And I thought, all right, well, I don't do whales. I think you kind of have the wrong guy is what I'm thinking in my head. But in fact, I'm also thinking, I'm running the center where we're about using science and scientists to help. Here is a chance to actually help. So that sound that I played for you is science. That's a supplementary materials file in a research project about studying the acoustics of humpback whales. And here was this humpback whale that the Coast Guard was trying to get out of Ventura Harbor. Little tiny whale, scared to death. It's trapped in the back of this harbor, running into boats, running into the shore. You know, we had television cameras everywhere looking at this whale, and I thought, okay, well, what do we know about whales? What do I know about whales? Well, I know whales are a lot like undergraduates at UC Santa Barbara, which is to say they're very, very smart. But they're also motivated by two things. One, they're motivated by sex. Two, they're motivated by food. This is a baby.
Is that also like undergraduates at the University of Santa Barbara?
Exactly like undergraduates at UC Santa Barbara. This is a little whale, so we're thinking maybe we have a bit of traction on the food angle. So I took that song, that bit of science, it was just about describing the pure acoustic biology of these whales, went down to the mouth of the harbor, took an underwater hydrophone, put it down there, sat there all night long playing that feeding song, and the whale heard it, went out of the harbor, and made its way to freedom. And that was an amazing moment. That was science actually doing something that was helping a marine animal, helping the oceans. But it was just one whale for which there are many whales at risk in a really big ocean. So we thought, well, are there any germs here? Is there anything in that story that we can amplify, and what can we do in our backyard, in our sanctuary that's been working on some of these problems for whales for decades, which is what then got us into, just jump ahead to the next slide. The last picture here, goodbye whale, you made it to freedom. So in this slide, if you folks can see that, excellent. So we thought, how can we amplify this impact? What can we do in the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary? What can we do with technology? What can we do with science to actually apply science to make change? Well, the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary have been working on reducing a problem where whales are getting run over by ships for decades. They've been doing all kinds of really intelligent things and making important inroads in this problem. And we said, how can we reinforce what they're doing with what we do, with more science and more technology? And so that gave rise to what we're working on now, hand in hand with the National Marine Sanctuary, where we're using technology, we're building a sensing system that will, near real time, use thermal sensors that are looking for the heat signature of whales, acoustic sensors that are listening for whales, and then big data that's modeling when whales are present to detect when they're there inside the sanctuary in the middle of these shipping lanes, and getting that data into the shipping companies that want that data to be able to slow down and avoid running over the whales. So that's our journey so far, and it is sort of a long journey of travel from being a professor that just does research to trying to continue to use that research to try to fix problems in important places like our sanctuaries.
Thanks, Doug. I think that's a great example of bringing together a lot of different pieces to create positive outcomes, and that's really like what we're trying to get after here. Speaking of somebody that's created positive outcomes, Carrie, I want to bring you into the conversation. So you've focused a lot of your work on sort of this dichotomy that we live in a country where we have an overabundance of food, yet 1 in 6 of us is facing hunger. Yeah. And through a series of things that you've done in your career, you focused on that, not always specifically on the ocean, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and maybe work in, how does the ocean really play a role in the change that you're seeking?
Sure. So I have the privilege of being able to work for the largest grocer on the planet. So Walmart, many of you may know, little company out of Arkansas, great state of Arkansas, which is really started with a very simple idea. It started with the idea that in small communities and rural communities, that if you could save people money, they could have a better life, that they could actually get to the place where they could choose what they needed for their family, they could really access the goods, the services, the food, the basic necessities that were going to help them to thrive. And that idea started 50 years ago, and that company has grown. It's grown to being in 26 countries around the world. And that promise of delivering safe, affordable products to people in need at the times and places that they need them has continued to be the legacy. But something happened in the company about 10 years ago, and you mentioned hurricanes, and it was Hurricane Katrina, and many of you may have actually seen images of trucks kind of lining up. Walmart was one of the first companies to respond. They were there before the government was ready to be there. And what happened in that moment was the company realized the power of a business to be able to leverage their strengths and what they did best, in this case, logistics, access to product, and bring it to people in need. And that changed everything. At the time, the leadership of the organization said, what does it mean to be a 21st century leader? How does business play a role in the world? And they set out a vision that had 3 sustainability goals that were around energy, waste, and creating sustainable products. So that journey has been going on. And about 10 years ago, there was a seafood journey that started as well. And Walmart started to work with its supply chain saying, what could we do and what does it mean to be sustainable? Seafood really matters to people. More and more in a growing global middle class. You mentioned that a lot of my work has been in food security. That's how I got to seafood, and that's why it matters so much. Seafood is an amazing source of protein. You know, there are estimates, who knows about the numbers, but there are estimates that about 1 billion people in the world actually rely on seafood as a main source of protein, as their main source of food. That's important. That's really important. As we get to, as we talked about, 9 billion people on this planet, that's only going to grow and that pressure is going to grow. So we have to think about how do we keep food safe, affordable, accessible with this growing pressure. That can't just be about the lowest cost today. That can't just be about what do we need in this case today. We have to actually be able to protect and do that in a way that's sustainable in the long term. There's also hundreds of millions of people around the globe that rely on the seafood industry for their livelihood. This is important. So saying that we're going to completely shift things or change things, that's a lot of actors to be able to shift behavior. We need to think differently about how we get 200 million people engaging in sustainable seafood issues and thinking about that in new and innovative ways, but also moving in positive directions. That's a huge, huge challenge. And that's not one that any particular company can solve alone. So when we started this journey about 10 years ago, we started thinking about what can business do and what is the right market signal? What's the most powerful thing that we could do? And at the time, it started with a journey of defining, well, what does sustainability even mean? What is that? What are the practices that matter? And how should we be thinking about that? And so we started turning to things like Marine Stewardship Council certifications. And we set a big goal. We said we are going to get, for our fresh and our frozen business in the US, we're going to get to 100% certified. We're going to do it in 5 years. We're going to work with our suppliers. I can't tell you, I know if any of you are thinking it, how many times people come up to me like, you work for Walmart, why can't you just tell your suppliers to do X? I get the question all the time on a number of different areas. This is one where we did that. Suppliers, we want you to be 100% certified. Go. 4 years later, we're about 50% of the way there. And it was really, really hard. It was really hard. And we weren't expecting the number of things to be in place that were barriers to that. There wasn't enough supply. There were challenges with getting projects more moving along the journey to be able to get to certification, and there weren't systems and tools for that. We weren't coordinated internally to be able to support suppliers as they were having those conversations. So we learned a lot about what it really meant to say, if we're going to say this is what we want, we actually have to be a part of the total system and the total solution of being able to help drive that change. And that shifted up for us again. So we started working in a more shared value kind of way, and you talked a lot about this, that businesses have to be able to take the idea of we can do good and we can leverage our strengths and we can lead through the business, but we also have to use other tools. We have to use philanthropy, we have to use collaboration with others, we have to use public-private partnerships if we're going to be able to shift these systems. A market signal alone is not going to be enough. We have to enable it with more. And so over the past couple of years, we've been doing much more work in working on public policy, understanding social and environmental issues and how they fit together, working with suppliers and being able to think about progressing fishery improvement projects over time. And in that, we are now, as of last year, at 100% certification in our fresh and frozen, which is huge. That's amazing. It's a huge milestone. It's progress, but it's just the beginning of the next step. We're looking at canned tuna now. We're looking at new ways that we can continue to move that along, and I can talk a little bit more about some of those.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. So we have 0.5% of the Fortune 500 represented here on stage, okay? So we cannot let that opportunity pass us by. So Carrie and Ruth, you both talked about public-private partnerships. Of course, you both work for large corporations. They're in the midst of their own transformations. And individuals, depending on who they are, will applaud that transformation. Some will criticize that transformation. We'll leave that to the individual. But what I'd like to know is, what things would you guys be looking for to actually accelerate the transformations that your two companies are going through, both from a public-private partnership standpoint, as well as, let's bring policy and government into this conversation. So
Sure.
Either one, give it a go.
Sure, I'll start. So this came up yesterday in the Arts and Conservation panel, but it was alluded to that there's a perception bias. So when we're really, what was it, the statistic 27 times to get someone to receive your message? That used to be 7 when I was in school, right? So you hear it 7 times, you memorized it. But I think it's a perception bias around these issues that you can't have everybody at the table. That the corporation side, they're bad. They have to be out, right? We're gonna solve this alone. But whether it's a hurricane issue, whether, especially after Deepwater Horizon, there was a lot of conversation around what do we actually know about the Gulf of Mexico? How much do we know? I actually came up hearing Margaret Davidson talk about this with coastal communities and coastal management. Now we're moving to that blue water. Well, we're the ones that are out there operating every day and going through these challenges and using technologies that we collaborate with the space industry on. This is not as simple as people think. They have a perception bias about how energy works and what we're actually doing. Part of that is on us, to do a better job of how we communicate, what Carrie talked about in terms of what we're doing internally. Like any government or corporation, or even academic, there's silos of excellence. That's what I've heard that term. So instead we're not siloed, but we're in our silos of excellence. We really have to get out of those. And part of it is getting people to the table. So I think to get rid of that perception bias is you have to put aside the opinion side and get everybody at the table, because what you'll find is there's a commonality, and especially around oceans and environmental stewardship. It's really about ocean health, making sure, our impact, we're minimizing that impact. We have the resources that we need to sustain growing populations, and what does that look like, and how does that balance against all the other uses? You can't do that if you're working under your perception bias. You need to get together at the table. And so we've really taken that initiative, especially in Gulf of Mexico, of getting people around the table to solve these big challenges. And what do we need to do that? On the government side, it's typically a funding issue. Funding cycles are very short. They're driven. There's a lot of politics that are in play. But when you're talking to Shell, and on one of our deepwater facilities, that facility's out there for 35 years, collecting environmental data every day, every hour, using technology and tools. So we're out there, right? So how can we work with the government cycles? How can we bring them in? How can we bring other NGOs that are doing work in the conservation space and really start getting around and saying, putting all the tools on the table, figuring out what that common goal is, and if it's around sustained observation, then take that goal and start working at it. Put the perception bias aside. We found that to be really successful. I think what we'd like to see more from our perspective, especially in talking with offshore environment, is we really like the opportunity to better work with government. I think throughout the years that's become difficult, whether it's silos, politics, or what. But really, if we're going to develop sustainable solutions for a lot of these big issues that we're dealing with the oceans, then we have to do that in a public-private partnerships and grow those partnerships over time. So I'd really like to see that go away, and I think you heard Admiral Gallaudet allude to some of these things that are coming to hopefully bring industry in. And why that's always been an issue, the second perception, at least from our end, is there's this regulatory black box, right? And so how can we work with you and regulate you? And we have to be able to work that nexus. And it's a hard thing for government to figure out, but when we all get to the table, we can figure out ways to do that. Develop the data, develop the science, go get the information, synthesize it, put it back into management, put it back into regulation, put it back into protection. We all can win at this, but it requires us to put away the perception, sit at the table, and really start putting pen to paper.
Yeah, Carrie, what would accelerate Walmart's transition?
Well, I would just add a couple of things to that because I think that you really articulated that very well. And maybe I'll just give a couple of examples of where we've seen that accelerated transformation. I think one thing that can accelerate it is not thinking of the government solely as the federal government. We've really seen where state level, local level, and at really thinking about the enforcement of law as being critical to seafood issues and oceans issues. So if we think about illegal and unregulated fishing, if we look at issues of things like human trafficking and people who are working on the seas, these are legality issues that are about, does the law actually say what we expect? And are we enforcing it at that micro level, which is the poured in, poured out, that very tangible moment. So that's multiple levels of government, and it's important for all of that system to be aligned and collaborating and working well.
Is it more important to work at one level of a government than the next, given where we are at a federal level right now? Or?
So I am a firm believer, having worked in the nonprofit, the government, and the corporate sector, and at local levels and at very large levels, that every chair that you sit in, and for you that are emerging leaders who are coming up in your space, it doesn't matter what chair you're in, it's powerful and it matters. And it's significant to be able to move the change from your perspective. No one knows the things that you know from that perspective. So while I do think the federal government is important, and it is important for us to shift that dialogue, there are many creative ways for us to do it, and change can happen from every seat. One example of this is the Paris Climate Accord. So we look at that in the parallel environmental space, thinking about climate change and emissions, the movement of We're Still In, of which Walmart has been a signatory, along with 2,700 other organizations, businesses, colleges and universities, the full perspective of organizations that you see, as well as government organizations. And so that's another great example of standing up and saying, that's fine, but we're still going to do and implement the work that matters.
All right, thank you. And we're here in Washington D.C., so we get to get to ask for what we want. You mentioned Paris. There was a time where the United States on the federal level was really seen as a world leader in environmental legislation, starting 100 years ago with Teddy Roosevelt and what he did in national parks, and of course in the 70s with the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. You mentioned Paris. I worked on Kyoto in a former life. We were we're the only country not in Paris. We were one of 3 that didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So one could argue that we've sort of relinquished our leadership from a national level. Bridget, I'll ask you the question. Is policy action to support the efforts that all of you guys are working on at a federal level, is it a lost cause?
I am fully caffeinated and hydrated, and so that means I will be the eternal optimist that it is not a lost cause, and I think we run the risk of fatigue. And so I don't know if we need to do shots of Gatorade or turn this into a circle and have a therapy session.
That might help.
But I do think that it's an oscillating change wheel, right? And so you're referencing Paris and Kyoto, and I was at our Oceans Conference in Malta, where there was also not a strong United States presence. And so flip that and bolster the local communities. In Chicago, it's our aldermen that said, great, we will secede from the union, so to speak, and do our own micro climate policy. And then incumbent on CEOs of businesses, whether it be a $62 million aquarium in Chicago or 1/5 of the Fortune 500 companies, to run our own micro universes, as if we had said yes to the Paris Climate Accord. So I don't think it's a lost cause. I think we just need to not be fatigued about the macro change and hold ourselves more accountable to the micro, including how you run your house and how I run my business and how you run massive 26-country businesses. And there'll be a time then when we oscillate back.
So leadership comes from different places at different times.
But I do think that there's a fear of abdication of responsibility at the local level because we're more frustrated about what's going on at the federal level.
Doug, so on this aspect from a policy perspective and sort of the local versus state versus federal, what are you seeing that you think are both bright spots as well as sort of frustrating pain points on what would enable you to get the work done that you're after?
Right. Well, it's easy to look out and see things that are not bright spots.
Right.
It's also easy to sort of follow up and point fingers at certain parts of the city here and say, you know, it is your office that's preventing us from getting successes in oceans and Great Lakes elsewhere in the environment. But, you know, honestly, Adam, I think it's my fault. I think it's our fault. I mean, I think that...
I'm looking for someone to blame. Doug.
It's our fault. I mean, I think we are on the hook here, and we're here in the room because we realize how important oceans and our lakes are. We know how important the environment is, and we know that in our own little worlds. I know that in my lab. I know that in my university. The students in my lab know that, but we're not doing a good enough job getting that message out. I mean, you look at the science for climate change, for ocean acidification, for overfishing, where it still occurs, and there's no ambiguity in the message that's coming out there, but there's no ambiguity for those that are looking at that science. So I'm not doing a good enough job getting that science to my neighbors, more importantly, to people that aren't my neighbors. So I'd like to point fingers and say, we're not getting to more bright spots because it's somebody else's fault, but honestly, I think we're doing amazing work. My gosh, you know, the aquariums are doing just an amazing job getting these messages out. But we need to do an even more amazing job because there's so much at stake. And I think if you take climate change as an example, there is no time to lose for the oceans. You know, for the oceans that are getting hotter, more acidic, and harder to breathe in, that's bad news and that's coming fast. So we have to redouble our efforts, you know. And for a bright spot, I live in a world where I get to see what opinion is and what perceptions are going to be like in the upcoming generations. So I live in a bright spot because I'll tell you that next generation users, they're going to be consumers at Walmart, they're going to be consumers of energy, they're going to be in your aquariums, are amazing. So the students at my university, the students at my colleagues' university get it. They understand the importance of science. They understand the importance of using science to fix the environment. So let's make sure we grab them and their friends, get this message to them. That's a collective sort of, those are marching orders for all of us. And let's get this message for the importance for all things related to sanctuaries, all things related to oceans and Great Lakes out there and make that stick so that you know, we can actually see the sort of change that we need to see at the federal level and beyond.
Yeah, for emerging leaders all throughout, it's not a question anymore. So, right. Bridget, did you want to add something?
I think, too, that the importance of what that message is and how it's communicated. So we all know, I'm not a betting person, but I'm going to bet that 100% of the people in this room know what salt water tastes like. And understand that pH and ocean acidification is logarithmic and it's really bad, and that the euphemism, I'm going to call it a euphemism, of coral bleaching means coral death. But bleaching, like, that sounds fine. I like my white Sprite and the coral bleaching. And so this message of ocean acidification is not a relatable topic, and coral bleaching does not strike fear in most people, in the United States and globally, as it does our hearts. And so that idea of taking the academic work and translating it and embracing that humans are a narcissistic species, and that's okay, and it needs to be relatable to us and the incredible aquatic animals and the macro scale. But until we can make climate change at human scale, so not geological scale, not global scale, human scale, which is the 20 miles I live my life in and the 2 generations I can comprehend, we will not move the needle. And so it's incumbent, so I'm gonna say maybe the blame is not Doug. It's informal science education to stop saying coral bleaching and saying that coral reefs are dying, and they represent that by turning white and opaque. Yeah. And so you are off the hook, and my colleagues in the aquarium and informal science have to double down on not becoming places of the big bummer, but aspirational, action-oriented, that where it's really crystal clear. The oceans aren't just getting more acidic, they're getting saltier. And you can actually taste different salinity of different pHs, and then all of a sudden, ocean acidification is at the human scale because it's my 5 senses and I can perceive it, and saltier water is bad. And I can get that, and I can get why an animal wouldn't survive in that. So you keep doing your good work, and we will try to be a more effective, louder Rosetta Stone bullhorn for people who aren't saltwater tasters, because you guys have been to the ocean, and lots of people at our aquariums have not. And so we have to make it relatable.
Yeah, and what I love about this conversation is that we're focused on all of you are focused on putting the onus on yourselves in your way to try to create this change that you're seeking. And I suspect that pretty much everyone in this audience is probably doing the same.
Well, let's stop sitting.
Yeah. I want to contrast that with something I learned about recently. So there's a consulting firm called Edelman that every year they publish a trust barometer. And it's a barometer of the trust in different institutions like NGOs, government, media, and so on. From 2017 to 2018, I've got the stats here. This is in 1 year, we had a 22-point drop in the trust in NGOs, a 20% drop in the trust in business. These are percentage point drops, and a 30% percentage point drop in government.
Can anyone go up?
No, media.
Museums are still the highest trusted source. We are seen as not having an agenda. We're not formal education, so we don't hold people accountable. Right, there's no test at the end of your museum or aquarium visit. We're not trying to pitch you something, a product, per cap. And we're not academic wonks. He's not one. I've heard of some. So aquariums, zoos, museums are still in the Edelman study. No change. So we didn't go up. You all just went down.
But how do we get that trust back, right? Because we need to reestablish that trust, we being all of us, in order to drive the agenda forward on creating the change that we need. So how do we get it back, guys?
Well, I can start with one of the things that we were talking just a lot about and thinking a lot about is transparency and giving people full access to information. So we've started to participate in things like the Ocean Disclosure Project. We've started to utilize technology, so things like blockchain and artificial intelligence and big data sets to better understand what's happening where there is opacity. I mean, these are complicated chains. Fish are tough. They move around. They're not hanging out in one part of the ocean and we're tagging them and that's their life cycle. They travel around the world before they end up in whatever place they end up serving a customer or in the water that is moving around, right? We know how interrelated these ecosystems are. And so it's very difficult to trace from one place to another. And I think that causes a bit of what you're talking about, which is I even might know, but gosh, what do I do about it? And I'm so overwhelmed by, I don't want there to be more salt in the ocean, and I don't want there to be these negative practices, but I don't know how to use my voice or my actions or understand how I make positive change. And I think that we've eroded a lot of this trust by telling people that they can do one good thing and finding all the negative externalities that can potentially come from that. And so that's a place where we also have to be really clear about what actions can do and what they can't do. Because no action is going to solve everything, and there's always going to be additional ramifications. That's the hard thing about how interrelated these issues are. So, but I do think that having more access to the raw portions of the data, where people can have the information, know it's there, and be able to make some of those decisions will help with some of the trust. I think the pathway to get there and doing that in a way that people feel good about the methodology of that is still uncharted and undefined territory.
Cool, cool.
So what I can add to that from a practical example, transparency is good, and consistency in messaging, we're hitting at that. We're not communicating doesn't mean just do it and they'll come. I mean, you hit on it perfectly. It's how you communicate. So I think in all of our different entities, we always have to sit down and do that. We're going through that as Shell. I'm sure you think you have the best idea, and it just falls flat, right? And so what our communications folks have started working with the technical experts and bringing all of these different minds to the table and figure out how do we do consistent messaging. But I want to give a practical example because I use kind of this, government science and government regulatory. One of the biggest things, and people who know me like to tell me that I sold out, because I worked for government, I was in academia, I started as a dolphin trainer, and I became a physical oceanographer working for the government, and then I just sold out going to Shell. And I said, well, why? It's not a sellout. They're looking for a solution, and they're bringing in the expertise. Instead of trying to figure it out, they're bringing someone in to help them. So maybe that's an example that we have to take. But the biggest thing I always get asked is, you just go out there and do your operations. You know nothing about the environment. You should be required to do assessments. You should collect data. You should do this. We're doing all of that. And some of that is regulated, but some of that is because of our stewardship mission. But the data that we're collecting goes to the government, and the government doesn't have capacity to do much with it. So then should we just walk away from it? And we decided, no, that's not a solution. So if we're giving data that the community wants and it's going to the government, then we need to help the government get it back to the community. And so, one of those recent successes, Department of Interior, we published a high-resolution bathymetry map for the Gulf of Mexico. That is from all of the industry data that has been collected in addition to all of the science data. So we're starting to see that, look, everything that we're collecting and things that matter from the oceans to people in the community shouldn't be data that is sitting on a shelf. It should be out there, and we should be working with the communities to make that usable information. Whether it's management, whether it's I want to go to this beach, whether I want to know what deep sea creature you saw because I saw it on the Okeanos. And you won't believe how many platform engineers called me and said, they're publishing this on NOAA and we see it every day. Well, then why aren't we telling that story, right? Why aren't we showing people what's out at our platforms every day? Adding to this excitement around oceans. So we're really kind of transforming that. And so bathymetry is the first step. We figured that out. Great. Industry's out there working every day doing habitat baseline. So that's the next data. Let's put the characterization data and get a full map of Gulf of Mexico or other areas and put all of that data out there. So I think you're starting to see at least a transformation where we're realizing there are benefits to working together, and maybe that we can start there, and then if we figure out how to tell the story better and we show that we're truly collaborative and it results in something, it's not just a lot of white space and a lot of talk. We have something people can use and they can access, and it matters to their daily lives. Coastal maps and information matters to people, right. And so how do we get that to them?
Yeah, Doug, did you have a comment that you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I'm a specialist in fish behavior, not human behavior, so moving a little out of my domain of expertise.
Sounds like they're very similar.
Yeah. Sometimes. I trust people that listen to me and then pay attention to the things that I say. And so I think we can maybe be better listeners. And professors are not famous for being good listeners. We're good at lecturing and not so much the listening part. But I think we can do a better job of that. You know, when we created the Benioff Ocean Initiative at UC Santa Barbara, we said, okay, I have an agenda, the scientists in my staff have an agenda of what we think we should do, but what if we tried an experiment and said, you, as in the world, tell us what you want marine scientists to work on. We'll listen to the problems that you're seeing in your own sanctuary, in the place where you're walking your dog on the beach, or et cetera. And we'll try to be responsive using science to help you. And that was actually really wonderful. That's how we got into whales, because we got a whole bunch of people that were worried about whales that were getting run over in the sanctuary here close to Santa Barbara. And I think that can help a lot. I mean, you said something, I think, a minute ago, where we know that things like ocean acidification, climate change is a big problem, but if we do a better job of listening to what people care about from the ocean, whether it's food or whether it's health or whether it's money, and we translate climate change or any of these threats into those currencies that people care about because we listened and understood what they care about, I think we'll have more of that trust back.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we only have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to go lightning round with 2 questions. Okay, you guys ready? We got to keep our answers short. The first one is, you know, you're the king of America or the queen of America. What one policy change would you make if you could?
Oh, I always have to go first. Well, I like to listen, so Carrie?
Nice work. Woo, hot potato. Anybody?
Is this one of those where you get to like wish for more policy changes?
Brilliant.
Like the genie lamp?
Just anything you want. You are.
Magnuson-Stevenson.
Yep.
Reauthorization. Done.
Okay. Carrie.
I need to think.
Ooh,
Ruth.
Doug.
Isn't there already a king of America?
Seems like it.
I think that protected areas, our monuments and our sanctuaries are really important, but I think that there's a lot of concerning things happening with monuments right now. I would step up and say, we need to stand by the Antiquities Act, and we need to make sure that these special places that encompass a lot of amazing biodiversity and food and economic values stay in good health.
Yeah, yeah. Carrie, Ruth, anything, or just?
Okay, I'm going to bring up, I'm going to put plastics out there because, you know, this is becoming a huge issue. Now, I want to put that out there considering where I am in the circular economy with plastics and where you are. But it's less about the products, it's more about the behavioral changes. So I want people to not have to see it on a video and say, wow, that's really sad, but it's not in my area, right? That whale, I've never seen that, a whale like that, right? Mm-hmm. So they have no idea, the people that are coming to your aquarium. I really want to get the behavioral changes so that we can deal with some of these solutions, and I'll put plastics on.
Okay, so on behavioral changes, we're going to wrap again, very briefly now. We have a bunch of emerging career leaders here in this room, a bunch of people that are establishing their careers, wanting to break into the ocean field. What bit of advice would you give people here that are more at the beginning of their career in terms of how they can both break into the field and what the biggest opportunities are now? Start on my left.
Partner with an organization, and that might be a micro partnership like a mentor, or actually ask your company to do it with another company that does not have blue in their logo, like Shed Aquarium and the Chicago White Sox, and asking them to shed the straw and get rid of single-use plastic at their stadium. Don't go for parallel partnerships, go for orthogonal ones. And the best way is not to have people have blue in their logo.
And the Cubs have blue, so.
Exactly.
Yeah. Carrie?
But they're next.
So always in a career, and I mentioned it earlier, right, every chair is important that you get to sit in. Be curious. Ask a lot of questions about why, and know the limits of your own tools. So as you think about the work that you do and as you're starting to break into a field, know what that work is really good at and know where the limits are, and ask why those limits exist, and find somebody that loves that limit and go talk to them. I mean, that really gets into that, why does this exist and who are the people that I really need to get to? You're never gonna change behavior unless you understand them and get to know them, and so that's a great way to get to that.
Right. Ruth?
I wouldn't say my career path was luck per se, but going through a traditional academic path, the discussion was interdisciplinary or not. You had to be so focused. I broke those barriers. Interdisciplinary matters, and it's orthogonal and it's diversifying. So if it's oceans, take an opportunity to learn different aspects, different seats of that. Diversify yourself in the space, in the policy space, because what you'll learn in one of those chairs might be the interactive, out-of-the-box solution to fix something in one of the other chairs. So diversify and be able to communicate. What you do matters. You have to be able to tell people why it matters, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't come into Shell saying, I love energy. But to me, it was the environment that matters. I came into the energy company to help them tell that story and do better at why the environment matters. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to conform, but diversify.
Doug, the final word.
Dear, do what you love is my final message there. Because when you do what you love, most likely you're going to be better at that than the other things that are there on the table. You're going to be more passionate about that, and that translates. That translates in people you're looking at. That when I look to collaborate with somebody, when I find people that are genuinely passionate about it, those are the people I want to work with. When I'm hiring people and I see that enthusiasm, those are the people I want to hire. So there's a lot of things here that I think young people love and should love, from communications to policy to science to education. Well, just figure out as you sample the playing field which of these you like most, trust yourself, and go for that with your entire heart and your entire mind. It'll serve you well, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I have a stack of questions here, very interesting questions, most of which I have not gotten to. So I'd encourage all of you to try to corner all of these people up here on stage and ask some of these really interesting questions. But I just want to end by saying thank you to all of our panelists, Bridget, Carrie, Ruth, and Doug. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing with us what you do and what you're after.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much. It was incredible. I just want to, right now, it's our next networking break, so please take time to continue the conversation and visit our exhibitors. We're going to begin at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Our Gulf Coast Restoration panel will be here in the auditorium. Hemisphere A will be featuring predicting, detecting, and preparing for ocean acidification. And in the value of protected places will be in Hemisphere B. So I look forward to seeing you back at 11. And for those on our live stream, we'll see you back at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you.